Hello, comrades. Welcome to another discussion between Caleb and I. And this time we're going to be talking about Anton Chekov's short story, At Home. And what a story it is.
Yeah.
Some people, especially at the beginning, you might have had a hard time getting into this one because it's like, it's just a story about like a dad and his son, and what's it all about? But I think that this is actually very, very profound, uh, thinking about the nature of stories and why stories matter. So, I'll give you a little bit of background real quick on the author before we jump in. Anton Chekov wrote a crazy amount of short stories. I think it's in the hundreds, actually, short stories he wrote. He was a very prolific author. But he's actually much more well known for his plays. He was primarily a playwright, and that's where most of it came. And if you're interested in his plays, some of his most famous ones are like The Cherry Orchard and The Three Sisters is another one. And usually what he's doing in both his plays and his short stories is trying to find the humor in situations that we might think are tragic. So I'm not sure that I don't think he's doing that in this story so much. I think this one is more meta about the nature of storytelling. But usually that's kind of his MO, is he would take stories about bankruptcy and about people making horrible decisions that ruin their lives. And he thinks it's absolutely hilarious because he's taking this kind of cosmic view that if you kind of detach yourself and you look at it from an outside observer, then it's pretty hilarious. He would say that if you think his plays are sad, and again, his plays are dealing with families falling apart, like old aristocracies losing all their money and having to move away from like their ancestral estate and that type of thing. And he would say something like, "Oh, comrade, if you think this is sad, you are too subjective. You must be objective. And when you go objective and look at it from cosmic perspective, you realize it's hilarious." And so that's usually who he is and what he's doing. I don't think that's what's going on in this story. I think this one is more, again, thinking about what it is, why stories matter. And he's using a story to talk about that. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But going off that, Caleb, tell me, what were your thoughts about this piece?
Well, I think it really drives home what we've previously talked about.
Mm-hmm.
It really does, because when you take a look at the story as a whole, what is the story about? It's about a guy and his son. Right, when it gets down to it, you got a minor role of a caregiver who is helping this district judge take care of his son. But this is a father, and this father is trying to find a way to help his son realize that smoking is bad.
Yeah.
And he goes through, I mean, y'all, but at this point, read the story.
Yep,
so,
they read it.
He goes through this series of inner monologue where he basically is trying to figure out the best method. And what struck me about him as I was analyzing his character was that he's constantly trying to better himself. And he's trying to be revolutionary in the way that, because he has come from a past where, when he was a kid, he was beaten when they did wrong, and he realized that beating is not really a very effective method of being able to be trained up, because you still don't get it sometimes. You still go back to the old ways, and so he's transformed from that. Though, so then he's like, well, maybe I can use my philosophical nature to be able to come up with the right words to say. But his child still doesn't get it because he's speaking on the terms that he would use in the court.
Yep.
And so towards the end of the story, he comes to the realization that it needs to be something more simple, something more childlike. And how can I explain this in the form that a child would understand? And so instead of like using instead of beating his son, which he thought about, instead of using a bunch of fancy words to try to explain it, he explains it to him in the form of a story. And he makes it relatable to his son so that his son then connects with the character and then learns the lesson internally. And by the end of the story, we know that the son then says, I will not smoke anymore because
I won't
now
smoke anymore.
I realize the danger. And it really kind of hits home with his son in a way and resonates with him in a way that otherwise would have been impossible.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, we all are in the same boat as this kid. You know, it's like the father gives this example. And I thought this was a really good example to give of the jury. And what is the principal role of the jury? It's to listen to both sides, make a judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, in the case of the kid, you know, he didn't respond when his father was trying to speak to him as an adult.
Yeah.
But he responded well when the father told him this story. He saw himself in this story. Mm-hmm. And then because he saw himself in this story, the story was compelling. And it drove him to want to make this own change in his life because he was compelled by what happened to the main protagonist. He was compelled by what happened to the main character.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we as writers, and that's what you as the readers can really find in stories, is those moments of connection in which you see something that is happening in the story. You're like, oh my goodness, that's happening to me in real life.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, you know, I never realized, you know, and then you start seeing how they're handling the situation, and you come to realize, or maybe it's something that you didn't even realize was bad. Maybe it was something that a bad habit that you didn't realize, you know, really, I need to do something about this because, you know, there's a need for change that takes place. There's a whole method, like, it really is like a reflection of yourself in a sense, because you're not only connecting with these characters and journeying on this pathway with them, but you're also realizing how much of yourself is in this story. Yeah. And through this story, then you come to this moment of realization that, yeah, I need to change something.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Man, Caleb, I think you just totally hit the nail on the head with all of those things. I think this story is fundamentally about this problem of teaching. What is the most effective way to teach, right? And in this context, specifically a father and a son, like the best way to teach parents, his son, and how to teach him, don't smoke, you know, that kind of thing. And you were 100% right that he knows that. He throws out a bunch of different things, and you talked about this completely. I'm just reiterating. Beating, not good, right? He realizes that's not a good way to do it. And then he tries to use logic, specifically through argument. As you said, he tries to treat him like a juror, where it's like, okay, listen, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you know, you can't keep doing this, because if you do this, then you'll get lung cancer. And if you get lung cancer, then it's all right. Tries to use that, right? And as you saw, for the child, it doesn't work at all. He can't even really follow his clear point B, point C kind of argument about why this is true. The only thing that works is something he didn't even really think was a method, right? Because the text says he didn't start out telling the story thinking, I'm going to tell a story about why smoking is bad. It's just that kind of organically arose out of the story he was telling. And so the story actually worked, right? Where the son said, oh, I won't smoke anymore. Yeah, no, because of that. And then with the dad, the story ends with this very interesting idea where he's thinking about, you know, in Russia, and this is true in the West as well, same place, both where we've both been influenced by the Enlightenment and all of that kind of stuff. He's talking about how he recalled the jurors who simply have to have a speech made to them, the public, who assimilate history only through epic legends and historical novels himself, who had derided the meaning of life not from sermons and laws, but from fables, novels, poetry. It's the interesting thing that we are, as a society, we and Russia at this time, we all really value logic, right? We all want to be logical. We all want to have reasons for why we do things, right? And this happens all the time when we debate things, right? What is the logical thing to do with any topic, from like big issues in government to down to what should Caleb and I do for lunch or something, right? Like, where should we go? Well, Chick-fil-A is pretty expensive, but they got that sauce that's like crack. And so there's all of that. And we debate these things, we have logic. But what's really interesting is, just like with the sun, most people do not respond well to A, B, C argument, right? Of if X, then Y, right? They do not respond to that. As a matter of fact, surveys have been done that show that people do not usually change their minds on any big topic based on an argument, right? Of like a presentation of point A, point B, point C. And I think all of us know, if you're given the choice of sitting through a PowerPoint or listening to a story, we're always going to choose the story, right? That's just how it is. So there's this paradox that I think Chekov is getting at, where we say we want to be logical, but actually the most logical way of communicating, point A, point B, point C, doesn't actually work with humans.
And I think you've hit two fundamental things here, Hollis, with that, because you've hit on the fundamental problem and issue with debating.
Mm-hmm.
No two people go into a debate. You can debate me on this if you want to. But,
debate you on debating.
But no two people go into a debate without already knowing that they're not going to stick with. I mean, they're going to go into it with their mind already made up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that is the issue. They're in a world of logic.
Mm-hmm.
We're in a world of reality and logic. So when you enter into a debate with Hollis, or with me and Hollis, let's say we're having a debate. We're having a debate over, Batman versus Superman, and which one is better.
Yeah.
and so, but Hollis has already made up his mind that Batman is the one. I've already made up my mind that Superman is the one, and we're not going to change our minds at the end of it. So what do we end up doing? Just arguing.
Yeah.
And so that is the problem with debate. But what does stories do that debating doesn't? It takes us out of the realm of logic.
Mm-hmm.
It totally annihilates the realm of logic and says we are now no longer in the realm of logic. We are in a fictional world. We're out of reality and we are in a fictional world.
Mm-hmm.
And we are traveling with these characters. We're empathizing with these characters. We're seeing the struggle. And we're seeing life from their point of view. And that goes so much further with a person to show them why things happen the way that they happen from this person's point of view, to make them believe what they want, make them believe why they believe what they believe. And so it gives them all the reasons, but it does it in an aspect that is out of this realm of logic. So it opens that doorway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You bypass that kind of part of the mind that is dealing with, like, is this true or not? Well, I'm right, you're wrong. So I'm just not going to listen to what this guy says, even if he's got an ABC, type of argument. Not going to listen to him about that. And it bypasses that completely. You're right, Caleb, to get that empathy aspect of the story and the characters and all those things, which Chekov, I think, illustrates brilliantly with the son, and how he related to the prince character. And then the prince, because of his smoking, he caused his father to die and all that kind of stuff. And he's like, oh, I won't smoke anymore, right? And this is one of, I think, the most interesting philosophical questions about stories. And it's also, I think there's still a mystery to it, because why? It doesn't really make sense logically that it would be that way, that stories would be more effective than ABC logic. It doesn't, there's something about it that's mysterious. And maybe you figured out the answer, Caleb, but I have not figured out the answer just of why stories are more effective at doing that. I know empathy is a big part of it, but at the end of the day, you may have figured it out, you let me know, but I'm not sure that anybody really understands fully why that is. And that's what drives people like I think you and me and scholars who study stories for a living, is figuring out the power that stories have to influence.
Well, Hollis, I've never actually thought about it before until you mentioned it just now.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, when a person, like, the reason, I think one of the biggest reasons for this, Hollis, is because when you look at a situation from a standpoint of A, B, C, and D, the person again has already, like, they know, like, their mind is already closed off completely. Because they've already got this. It's kind of like back to the prodigal son. Like the elder brother at the end of it had this preconceived notion in his mind, and he was going to stick with it no matter what. And so he was debating his father about it. But what his father was trying to make him see was the point of the whole story, and that he was in fact the owner of everything. And so I think part of the reason for why stories are more effective is because this method closes off the mind, whereas this method of storytelling opens the mind.
Yeah, it does. That's a good point. Yeah, these logical arguments don't actually, and again, it's crazy, it's bizarre, but statistically speaking, it's true. People aren't convinced by arguments.
Yeah.
They just aren't. Statistically speaking, if someone has made up their mind on any issue, arguing is not going to get them to change their mind. No matter how much you prove that they are wrong about that issue, it just doesn't do it. But stories do. And
I don't know if that answered your question or not.
I think it does, because it gets you. I think that part of it is perhaps when we get too focused on logic, like the dad did. He's very focused on logic. He's a judge, all those sorts of things. He's constantly thinking of what the right thing to do is and how to explain this, rational, all those sorts of things. When we get so caught up in that, we actually, I think, lose or miss out or don't understand that that's only part of what it means to be human and what humans are doing. We aren't just rational. We have the emotions. We have our empathy capacity. There's so much more to a human being than just their capacity to logic. And what I think stories do is they wind up engaging more of the person than just the logic does. They're not just appealing to their rationality. They're appealing to all of them, because we relate to each other with all of us, not just our logic, but all of us. And we relate to characters in that same way, as you were talking about. And as we see Chekov illustrating with the son and the prince character, we bring that to the text, to the story. And when that happens, there's this interaction where we can be brought into more understanding of what's going on. Now, I think that also opens up a interesting danger, which is that stories have this ability, and therefore that puts, I think, a very high level of responsibility on the author to be very careful about how they wield this power that they have with storytelling. Because as we talked about before, another very important thing about storytelling is that your brain actually experiences the same things that you're talking about when you are doing a well-done story. And so that opens up a bunch of ethical questions about what should you expose somebody to in a story, and what kind of messages could you get from a story that may not be good. And that's where I think there's still a level of critical thinking logic you have to bring in. But at the same time, the ethical things we have to think about as storytellers is you better make sure your message is a good one. Because if you're wielding this much power, you've got to make sure that you are sending something out into the world that's going to be positive and not something that's going to be negative or harmful to somebody.
And also think about it too in the context of, Hollis mentioned y'all are going to be writing a story.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure at some point Hollis is going to get up and say, okay, I want you all to pick your message for what you want to do for your story.
Exactly.
And in that, bear that in mind, that you have that responsibility. I also think, Hollis, that there's a responsibility as you are reading the short stories that Hollis has selected, and not even just stories in general. Mm-hmm. There's a responsibility, be alert. Mm-hmm. Be alert that certain there are stories that have this power, and if you're reading them, you need to remain alert that, the messages of these stories are colored by the author. Mm-hmm. And the author is doing their best to convince you of these ideas that they are true. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes those messages may not be the best,
Exactly.
Because while we're talking about being ethical, there are authors out there that aren't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and so it's up to you as the reader to read the text and be alert that don't just take something and think, oh, this is what I need to change in my life, because there are instances in which the author is wrong.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. 100%. Because, and that's part of why we do this analysis. Why do we analyze stories rather than just read them and enjoy them? Well, the reason we do analysis, in part, is to understand very clearly what that message is that the story is trying to tell. And then you can think, is this message really something that is good or correct or right? And so logic does ultimately come back, but you still have to experience that story first and then analyze it to understand what's going on. And I think that a lot of times what you will wind up coming away with is, even if you don't, for instance, ultimately agree that smoking is bad, the father in that story, you're still going to have an experience by reading that story.
Yeah.
And that story is going to help you understand more, for instance, how smoking has ruined some people's lives, and what that happens.
Take for example, Hitler. Okay, so in Hitler's book, I think it's Mein Kampf. Yeah, in Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, it's a very compelling text of what he believes. Mm-hmm. I mean, the guy convinced an entire nation to rise up, and try to take over the world. Mm-hmm. Now, is the ideas in that story good? Absolutely not. Nope. But if you go to any communications course, they're going to tell you, look to Hitler, because Hitler convinced an entire nation and compelled an entire nation that his ideas were correct, even if they were not right.
Yeah. And that's important, because stories, especially like that, can be a means of controlling people that is more effective than logic, right? Because there's a phrase that I've heard more recently, and I think is very true. Whoever controls the narrative controls the world. Whoever controls the story of what has happened or what is happening. And if they tell the best story, whoever tells the best story is the one who is controlling what's going on, because the best story is the story that's going to engage the most people, and the most people are going to believe.
Yeah.
Hitler told a very compelling story about the history of Germany and how Germans were the best race that had ever lived, and how they had been done wrong by, what happened at the end of World War I, and how they had been tragically oppressed by these Jewish people. And so that they needed to rise up and to fix these things. And it was a compelling story, but it wasn't a story that was ultimately true
Yeah.
or a story that was good for the world at large because of the devastation that that story brought. And this is true of many, many different circumstances in history. You can look at the story of colonialization, for instance, with England and France and how they went to Africa and India and, well, mostly those two places. They tried in China, but China was already set up, and China kind of kicked them out of that. But
China kind of falls under this category.
well, yeah. But anyway, they had this story about how the Western world, England, France, Spain, how they had been chosen by God to bring civilization to these savages, in America and Africa and India and all these places, and how it was their destiny and their right to go in there and subjugate those peoples to them and destroy the culture that existed there and set up a replica of English culture or French culture or Spanish culture or whatever. And it was a very compelling story, and lots of people bought into it. There were missionaries who were fully convinced that that story was right, that they were there to, yes, to Christianize them, to make them saved, but to also make them like the English, or like the French, because they were the ones who were superior. They were the ones who had the culture and all those sorts of things. And it was a compelling story.
If you look at the Civil War.
Oh yeah.
The Civil War is the exact same thing. Who controlled the narrative of the Civil War?
Exactly.
You have two different sides. You have the South and you have the North, and they're divided on what the South is saying. Yes, let's have slavery. The North is saying no. It's the terrible idea.
Exactly.
And now you've got these two arguing narratives. Now we've got to determine, that now there needs to be a war.
Exactly. Competing stories that ultimately caused a real war over that. Yes. So, bottom line is very, very, stories are incredibly powerful. Don't underestimate the power of stories. And I would dare say, if you want to be somebody who influences people, who has an influence on the world, stories are the way to go, not the ABC logic way. You want to become a storyteller if you want to be somebody who is influencing people. But that comes, beware, with a great ethical responsibility to make sure that the messages that you put forward are ultimately, like I said earlier, positive messages. They're not going to start World War II or Civil War or those sorts of things. You want to tell stories that are ultimately going to be something that brings people up and brings them into greater goodness, understanding, empathy, all of that kind of stuff. Not all of those things, those virtues, rather than the vices. And the dad, I think, realizes ultimately that he did that, but he's still disturbed by the fact that the logic didn't do it, the story did. And that's what we all have to wrestle with.
And I think that another thing about the dad is he's just overthinking it.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I think
overthinking.
And I think that we can do that with stories too. We can overthink and overanalyze a story to death, or we can stick to this method A, B, C, and D. Well, that logic doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't I just don't understand why this worked when this didn't.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what I think stories get you to do. Is there is ultimately a place where you have to get outside of logic in order to actually understand. It's a paradox. And it's something we academics really don't like to say a lot of times, because we tend to be really big in logic, us college professors and whatnot. But one of the benefits of stories is it gets you past that. When you're stuck in logic, stories can get you past that, can get you past things you can't get with logic. I'll give one other example, a TED Talk I heard recently, where there was a guy who admitted that he got into college based on a philosophy paper he wrote about relativism, which, if you're not familiar with that term in philosophy, it's basically to say that there are no absolutes. Everything is relative. So, stealing is wrong. A relativist would say, well, you can't really say that because, well, what if someone is stealing to feed a starving family, or something like that? Is that really wrong? That sort of thing is where the relativism would go, and they would say that no action that we would typically consider to be wrong is wrong in all situations. They would say you can never say that. And he said that he always would question people, like when they would say this is absolutely true, he would say, well, you're sure about that? Or what about in this context or that context? And that's how he was until he met somebody who had been a survivor of sexual assault. And he said that when she told him his story and he looked in her eyes as she talked about what she went through, her story and her pain, he just knew this is wrong. No matter what, this is wrong. There's no two ways about it. This is wrong. And it was not logic that got him there, but it was listening to somebody's story, what somebody actually went through that got it. So that's what I think this is all about. That's what I think Chekov is trying to get us to understand and learn in this story. And that's something I think we should all keep in mind as we continue to go about our daily lives. And we encounter stories all the time. And we tell stories. Think about this. How can we use stories to bring people together? How can we use stories to make a positive impact on the world? How can we start maybe telling more stories and arguing less? That kind of thing. Anything else to say?
Yeah, I totally agree with you 100%, Hollis. One thing that I would say, and this is just a word of advice, if you're just starting out in writing stories, I would say, don't write in third person at first.
Okay.
Write in first person. And the reason why I say that is it's a lot easier when you're first starting out as a writer if you're writing in first person to describe things, to be able to describe and get your point across. So, in first person, you use I instead of Katie and Sally. You'll use I talk to Katie, I talk to Sally. And so, but it really does, like I went to the counter and on the counter there was, a bag of apples and there was a bunch of pineapples. And so I decided I would cut up the pineapples. And it's just a lot easier when you're first starting out in writing to explain and kind of get your point across better and help your reader be able to see what you're saying more. When you become more experienced in writing, when you've written some things and you realize, like you've gotten the narrative down of how you write, then you can transition to third person in which you can start broadening your horizons and start looking at a story from top down as opposed to in the story.
Yeah, that's a really good point because all the stories we have read so far, you will all have noticed, are all in third person. But stay tuned because as we keep going, you'll find more text starting to be written in first person, like Caleb was saying. And he's right. That is usually a better way to start out when you're writing, is to start in first person rather than the third person.
It gets complicated when you're writing in third person. It can get quite complicated, especially when you start getting into where did I leave that character again?
Yes, especially Caleb is very known for complexity in his stories and plots. So that can be a thing too. So cool. Well, unless you have anything else, Caleb, I think we will call it on this lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed at home, and I hope that you have gotten something out of this first unit so far. I look forward to reading your papers and seeing what you guys have to say and trying your own crack at analyzing stories.
Thank you for having me, Hollis.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for being here, Caleb. And we will see you all again at another time.
Bye-bye, everybody.